Right. Good morning again. And we are about to launch ourselves into the second part of the epistle to Arbuthnot, Dr. Arbuthnot. Now, we have already seen that in the first part, that's approximately the first 150 lines of the poem, Pope has talked about uh, his presentation or his self-projection as one of the preeminent poets of the 18th century, this epicenter of the literary circle, the 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 just critique, uh, the epitome of the perfect satirist. Now he's largely talked about himself, and he's talked about being besieged by people who want to bring their poetry to him. Now, I've also just pointed out how Pope, through these self-portraits, also talks about the various phenomenon of contemporary print culture of the period, especially the system of patronage, the rise of Grub Street and cheap print culture, and how Pope projects himself as the high point of high culture, as it were, in the 18th century, the man of taste. Now, in the second segment today, we will have two sections, two different sections. One in which Pope will talk about his own inclinations to write. Why does the poet write? What is his motivation to write? This is one of the first parts. And who are his inspirers? That's the first part of the discussion. And in the second part of the discussion, we'll look at this question of poetic rivals also. So who are his poetic rivals, antagonists? And in looking at them, Pope is not merely looking at the person as such, but he's also looking at different kinds of literary vices of the 18th century. I mean, say, false patrons, envious poets, right? So he's talking more about the literary circle of the 18th century than about individual figures, although individual figures do come in as targets of his satire. So we'll look at two portraits today. We'll look at Atticus, who will represent the essayist and dramatist Joseph Addison, and we'll also look at Buffo, who will sort of look at the false patron in the in the Earl of Doddington, right? So these are the two figures, the two seminal antagonistic figures whom Pope will be describing. But we will begin with asking this question of Pope as to why he chose to write poetry. What was his motivation in writing poetry? And therefore, let me now project my screen so that you can take a look at the poem. Is the poem visible to you?
Yes, sir.
Right, good. So it stopped here, if you remember, 124, 125 onwards. Why did I write what seemed to me unknown? So that's the question he's asking. And you can see that there's always this dramatic note within Pope's poems. Is sort of this entire poem sort of moves in a type of a pattern of a dialogue where, Pope is, as it were, talking to Arbuthnot. Arbuthnot is intervening. There are also moments when Pope is asking himself. So it's a deeply self-reflexive poem. Pope, in his mature years, pondering as to why he had to write, and therefore there is an intense tone of self-justification also within the text, as you can well understand. Why did I write what sin to me unknown? Dipped me in ink, my parents or my own. Yet, as a child, not yet a fool to fame, I lisped in numbers, for the numbers came. So Pope is suggesting that he was a compulsive poet. He was a poet by nature. So it's deeply within him, there is the inspiration. There is this almost a childhood vocation to be a poet. Now, very interesting is this concept of spontaneity. I list in numbers, for the numbers came. Now, this spontaneity is in contrast to the false poets that he has described, who sort of who carve out spiders' webs and who write laboriously. Pope is blessed, and that is the concept that he's providing us. Pope is blessed with a natural genius for poetry, which is embedded within his childhood, right? So this notion of the poet, genius poet, for whom poetry is a vocation rather than a craft. I list in numbers, for the numbers came. I left no calling for this idle trade, no duty broke, no father disobeyed. The muse but served to ease some friend, not wife. So he's saying I did not write for anybody. I wrote because, it was my vocation, it was my genius to write. The muse but served to ease some friend nor wife. And then comes a very interesting, line which describes his, the almost pathetic sick life that Pope led to help me through this long disease, my life. Right. So Pope, as you know, suffered from polio, and he suffered from a deep form of meningitis, and therefore he had a stunted growth. He was frequently sick, right? And he was only 4 feet tall, stunted growth. Therefore, Pope is referring to this long disease, my life, almost in a sort of tone of self-pity. So this is suggestion that although he is not blessed with a very robust physique, he is blessed with a genius for writing poetry, right? To second Arbuthnot, thy art and care, and teach the being you preserved to bear, right? So Arbuthnot is thanked here for, taking care of Pope, being his physician. But why then publish? So that's the next question. So I wrote, but why did I publish? You see how very sequentially this poem is progressing. First, he's saying, shut the door, because I'm besieged. Then he's saying, why did I write? What is my difference with these poets? And then he's asking, why did I publish? He says, Granville the polite, and of course, referring to the contemporary poet and dramatist John Granville. He says, and knowing Walsh would tell me I could write. Walsh, once again, is one of the major poets of the period. Well-natured Garth, Samuel Garth, the author of The Dispensary, is once again one of the more renowned poets of the period. So Granville, Walsh, and Garth, 3 major poets of the period, were his inspirers, inflamed with early praise. And Congreve loved, and Swift endured my lays. Both Congreve and Swift were part of the Scribblers Club, right? Therefore, Congreve loved and Swift endured my lays. The courtly Talbot, Somers, Sheffield, Reid, even Mitred, Rochester would nod the head. These are, once again, the noblemen of the period. So Pope's poetry was admired both by the contemporary poets and, of course, he was also feted by the contemporary aristocrats of the period, right? So Lord Somers and Sheffield, Duke of Buckingham. So Talbot was the Duke of Shrewsbury. Lord Somers and Sheffield was the Duke of Buckingham, were both statesmen and patrons of Pope. Sheffield's poems were also incidentally edited by Pope. So Pope is talking about the elite circle of poets and peers who admired his poetry and granted him access to their inner circle. And St. John's self, great Dryden's friends before, so he's sort of claiming the literary lineage of Dryden, as it were. So Dryden's patrons also admired him. So Pope is creating a kind of a literary genealogy for himself, a literary history, for example, for himself, where, he has Dryden as his predecessors, then comes Garth, Walsh, Congreve, Swift, and Pope. So with open arms received one poet more. Happy my studies when by these approved, happier their author when by these beloved. So is creating his literary circle, defining his literary sphere, as it were. So these are the people whom he holds up as ideals, as contrasted with the people whom he will shortly criticize. Not from Burnet's, from these the world will judge of men and books, not from Burnet's, Old Mixon's, and Cook's. Now, Thomas Burnet was mocked Pope in a text called Pope Alexander's Supremacy. Old Mixon had criticized his work, and Cook also had libelled Pope. So these are his critics. So Pope is saying that the true judge of poetry will be Swift and Gay and Dryden, rather than Burnet's, Old Mixon's, and Cook's. So saying I was appreciated by the top poets of the period, whilst I was criticized only by the minor poets of the age. Soft were my numbers, who could take offense, while pure description held the place of sense. Like gentle Fanny's was my flowery theme, a painted mistress or a purling stream. Right, the painted mistress is probably a reference to both Addison's poetry and also painted mistress to, the Rape of the Lock, Belinda in the Rape of the Lock. Yet then did Gildon draw his venal quill. Now, Gildon was one of the minor poets of the period who had criticized the Rape of the Lock. Right, so the Rape of the Lock, once again, is the text that is being alluded to. I wished the man a dinner and sat still. Yet then did Dennis rave in furious fret. Once again, John Dennis criticized Pope's Rape of the Lock in the Progress of Dullness. Right, so once again, critics of Pope. I never answered, I was not in debt. If want provoked or madness made them print, I waged no war with Bedlam or the Mint. The Mint, once again, if I have already told you, is the place where debtors used to hide. So Pope is suggesting that his seat is in Twickenham, in the Scriblerus Club, with the literary artists of the period, whilst his critics belong to Bedlam or the Mint. They are either broke or they are mad, right? So there are, like Dryden's Macflecknoe, if you observe, Pope is creating two sets of poetic hierarchies. One is the hierarchy of true poetry of good sense and taste, where Dryden is the progenitor, and then comes, Garth, Walsh, Congreve, Swift, and Pope. Right, this is the courtly high culture. So Pope becomes the kind of a defender of high culture versus his critics who belong to Grub Street and who are marked by madness and spite. Right, so perennially, recurrently, Pope will associate his critics with falsehood, plagiarism, poor taste, and also of madness and being completely bankrupt, right? So these are images that Pope is creating to create binaries between good poetry and bad poetry, and thereby draw his image as the protector and the epicenter of good literary taste. Did some more sober critic come abroad? If wrong, I smiled. If right, I kissed the rod. So Pope is suggesting that he had kept his moderation. He had not lashed out. He had kept his sense. Pains, reading, study are their just pretense, and all they want is spirit, taste, and sense. So all they want, they do not have spirit, taste, and sense. Pope has that. So in dismissing these satiric portraits, Pope is setting for himself the binary, what he has. And what does he have? Spirit, taste, and sense. Right? So that is what Pope suggests is the true hallmark of the good poet. Commas and points they set exactly right. So they deal with trivial things, and 'twere a sin to rob them of their might. Yet never one sprig of laurel graced these ribalds, these dirty poets, as it were. From slashing Bentley, Bentley was a rival poet to Pope, and Bentley had actually tried to correct Milton's Paradise Lost, suggesting that Milton, due to his blindness, had used an anamnesis who had sort of messed up Milton's lines. So from slashing Bentley down to piddling Tybalt, Tybalt was one of, again, his rival poet, each wight who reads not, but scans and spells, each word catcher that lives on syllables. So these are, word catchers, critics who are word catchers, who are minor, who raise minor points. Such piecemeal critics, some regard may claim, preserved in Milton's or in Shakespeare's name. So Tybalt was an editor of Shakespeare, and Pope is referring to, the Tybalt being Theobald. And Pope is suggesting that they can correct a little bit of Milton here or Shakespeare there. Pretty in amber to observe the forms of hairs of straws or dirt or grubs or worms. Once again, the reference is to Grub Street and these critics who sort of thrive on dirt. The things we know are neither rich nor rare, but wonder how the devil they got there. So it's justifying himself that in the beginning he wrote poetry, and he did not care who criticized him or the other. Were others angry, I excused them too. Well might they rage, I gave them but their due. A true man's merit, 'tis not hard to find. A man's true merit is, 'tis not hard to find, but each man's a secret standard in his mind. Once again, he's suggesting that, everybody has an intellectual standard to whom they sort of conform, and they write their poetry according to it. That casting weight, pride adds to emptiness. 'Tis this who can gratify. So suggesting that these critics and false poets are empty in their mind, and they are marked also by the presence of an ego. So saying it's a deadly combination. These critics of his are marked by empty minds and high egos. So that casting weight, pride adds to emptiness. This who can gratify, for who can guess? The bard whom pilfered pastoral's renown, who turns a Persian tale for half a crown. Now this reference to the Persian tale for half a crown is a reference to his rival poet Ambrose Phillips, who translated a book called The Persian Tales. Right, so these are dense allusions to his rival poets once again. The bard whom pilfered pastoral's renown, who turns Persian tale for half a crown. Half a crown was the normal expense or the charge of a prostitute. So he's referring to these poets who thrive on others' poetry or who plagiarize as prostitutes. Now, you remember that Dryden had also used this metaphor in Macflecknoe. So, Pope is criticizing a range of things here. He's criticizing false taste. He's criticizing intellectual emptiness. He's criticizing pettiness of mind. He's criticizing personal spite. So he's sort of drawing upon this atmosphere of great poetic rivalry of the period, where you had an incessant poetomachia or conflict of the poets. Just writes to make his barrenness appear, and strains from hard-bound brains 8 lines a year. Right, so these are poets who have no natural genius. Contrast this with, I lisp in numbers, for the numbers came. Right, and therefore these poets strain from hard-bound brains 8 lines a year. So they rack their brains for poetry. He who's still wanting, though he lives on theft, so he's now accusing them of plagiarism, steals much, spends little, yet has nothing left. That's a beautiful line, satirical line. The poet steals much, spends little, yet has nothing left because he's fundamentally empty. And he who now to sense, now nonsense leaning, means not but blunders around a meaning. So you remember Dryden talking about Shadwell never deviates into sense. So Pope is also creating this almost quasi-mock epic figure of the poet who attempts heroically to write poetry, but cannot because he fundamentally lacks sense or poetic genius. And he whose fustian so sublimely bad, it is not poetry, but prose run mad. Now, once again, these are all references to his poetic rivals. It is not poetry, but prose ran mad. All these my modest satire bade translate, and owned that 9 such poets make a Tate. Tate, of course, you remember, changed the ending of King Lear. How did the fume and stamp and roar and chafe? So they rode against me, they fought against me, they wrote against me. So Pope is dismissing these critics as empty and swear not Addison himself was safe. Now comes the first. So this is the second segment of the poem, right? The second segment where Pope has fundamentally asked 2 things, or rather has said 3 things. The first question is, why did I write? He said, I wrote because I had genius, and I lisp in numbers for the numbers came. Secondly, why did I publish? Because I had a great circle of poets around me who inspired me to publish, right? So I was in the literary epicenter. And thirdly, how did I react to criticism? I did not react that much because around me were poets who wrote foolishly. So what could I do, right? And he's dismissed these poets as empty of mind, literary prostitutes who write for money. Thirdly, plagiarized, the poets who plagiarize from different sources. And fourthly, fundamentally are barren and make an effort to compose, yet cannot succeed. Right? So Pope is here creating a series of binaries. Good poet has genius. Good poet is original. Good poet writes effortlessly. Good poets write profusely and have sense. Bad poets, they lack genius. They strain to write their poetry. Bad poets, they plagiarize. They are not original. Bad poets, they write much, but all of it is like the spider's thread. And finally, bad poets are akin to madness and pettiness. Now, the term pettiness, and he comes to Addison now, and the first portrait. This is the third segment of the poem, where we are now moving into Pope's portraits of his rivals. And the first portrait is that of Addison, who is here given the role of Atticus. Now, please remember that uh, Addison and Pope, Addison, of course, remember, was one of the preeminent literary figures of the period. And Addison was seen as this great classicist. Remember his great tragedy called Cato. Of course, you will also have remembered the Spectator papers, which set the tone of the literary period. Right. But Pope and Addison had a very checkered history. Pope was initially extremely admired Addison much. And then he had sort of written Rape of the Lock, and he had wanted Addison's opinion as to whether he should keep the sylphs or not. Addison had asked him to remove the section. Pope had gone against his wishes and had published it with the sylphs. And therefore, Pope saw within Addison a rival. Not only a rival, Addison was a greater, probably, personality than Pope in the literary scenario, but Pope saw him as essentially envious. What Pope is here criticizing is the poet who is good, who is great, but who is envious, and he allows no other rival poet to flourish. So, Addison is seen as the jealous poet who builds his own coterie and is puffed up with praise, but who will never allow a rival poet to emerge. Right? So that is what or how Pope seeks to present Addison. Peace to all such. So Addison lacks generosity, as it were. But where there one whose fires true genius kindles and fair fame inspires. So Pope acknowledges that Addison was a true genius and deserved his fame. Blessed with each talent and each art to please, and born to write, converse, and live with ease. Such a man too fond to rule alone. So Addison always wanted everybody to be deferential to him and allowed no other rival poet. Bear like the Turk, no brother near the throne. So Addison was like the tyrant who allowed no rival poet near his poetic throne, as it were. View him with scornful yet with jealous eyes, and hate for arts that caused himself to rise. And then comes a very beautiful line, how does Addison criticize? Addison does not criticize directly. Damn with faint praise. So he praised but did not, faint praise is very, very, very scanty praise. Damn with faint praise, assent with civil leer, and without sneering teach the rest to sneer. So Addison is seen as this, influencer, as it were, right? He does not himself criticize, but by making snide remarks, asks his coterie to criticize. Willing to wound and yet afraid to strike, just hint a fault and hesitate dislike, right? So he would not be overtly critical, but he would just mention a few remarks where he could damn with slight praise. Alike to reserve to blame or to commend a timorous foe and a suspicious friend, dreading even fools by flatterers besieged, and so obliging that he never obliged, like Cato. Cato is the reference to Addison's dramatic tragedy. And like Cato gave his little Senate laws. So Addison is seen like the tyrant Cato, who is setting laws for his own Senate and who brooks no rivals near his throne. So it's this jealous monarch who guards his literary empire and who allows no other rival poet. So lacks generosity, is imbued with jealousy, even though he has genius. And sit attentive to his own applause. So once again, marked by a strong sense of ego. And wits and templars every sentence raise, and wonder with a foolish face of praise. Who must but laugh if such a man there be, who would not weep if Atticus were he. So Pope says, Pope is not just merely criticizing, he's lamenting the fact that such a great poet can be such a mean individual. So Pope is criticizing the genius of the poet, but he's criticizing the meanness of the individual, the lack of generosity of the individual, the egotism, and the kind of jealous nature of Addison. That is how Pope is criticizing Addison. Of course, Addison had passed away long before Pope was writing this. What though my name stood, and then again he talks about himself, right? And he talks about his poetry as being preeminent in 18th century London. What though my name stood rubric on the walls? So these are references to his posters of his poetry. In fact, Lintott actually sort of published these posters all over London, advertising in bold red letters Pope's poetry, or plastered posts with claps in capitals, so posters in capitals, or smoking forth 100 hawkers' load, on wings of winds came flying all abroad. I sought no homage from the race that write. So he is distinguishing himself from Addison here. He's suggesting that I sought no homage from the race that write. I kept like Asian monarchs from their sight, right? So I kept like Asian monarchs. I went silent. I was incognito. I did not meet them. I did not create my own coterie. This is how he's distinguishing himself from Addison. Poems I heeded, now be rhymed so long, no more than thou, great George, a birthday song, George Etheridge. I never with wits or witlings passed my days to spread about the itch of verse and praise. So I was not egotistical to praise myself all alone. This is a paradox and irony really, because in this particular poem he's precisely doing that. He's self-advertising. He's projecting himself as this great poet, yet he's saying that I never asked for praise. Not like a puppy daggled through the town to fetch and carry sing-song up and down, nor at rehearsal sweat and mouthed and cried, with orange and handkerchief at my side, but sick of fops and poetry and prate, to Buffo left the hold Castilian state. Now, Buffo, of course, is going to be one of the major figures of satire here, and Buffo refers to Bub Doddington, right? And I'm going to now project something else, and I'm going to discuss very briefly this estate of Bub Doddington. Now, Bub Doddington was one of the noblemen of the period, and Bub Doddington actually developed in Dorset. This is Bub Doddington, incidentally. You will see how he was the Baron of Melcombe, right? You see in that illustration there, Baron of Melcombe, and you can see how he was rotund almost, so puffed up, and Pope will describe him as a toad, right? He will refer to his physical attributes like a toad, right? So Bub Doddington had built in Eastbury one of the great estates, but this estate was, it was considered extremely clumsy, actually, right? So Bub Doddington was marked by, here you can see the cursor, bulk and corpulency, and this estate was criticized as extremely awkward and sprawling. So it was also criticized as exceedingly large and possibly one of the heaviest piles of stone Sir John Vanbrugh ever erected, right? So this is the Castilian state which Pope is referring to. In fact, Pope also referred to this ostentatious house as the chiming clocks to dinner call, 100 footsteps scrape the marble hall. Once again, Bub Doddington was also a very vain man who sort of became a patron to a lot of poets and he would patronize all poets who praised him. So he was this man of great ego. So the chiming clocks to dinner call, 100 footsteps scrape the marble hall. So these are all his, all these poets who have come to seek his patronage. The rich buffet, well-colored serpents grace, and gaping tritons spew to wash your face. Is this a dinner? This a genial room? No, 'tis a temple and a hetacomb. Right. And Pope wrote about Bob Doddington, saying, "Is too much a half-wit to love a true wit." So Bob Doddington is seen by Pope as this patron of great ego who has no taste, who only sort of praises the poets who in turn praise him. So he lacks wit, he lacks judgment, and too much half honest to esteem any entire merit. I must affront him to be rid of him. So Pope is here talking about, through Bob Doddington, the false patron who does not champion the poet of true wit, but who, to satisfy his own ego, merely throws parties and patronizes false poets. Right. Let us now get back to the poem after, having talked about Buffo and the Castilian estate. Proud as Apollo on his forked hill, so on Eastbury, this is his estate, sat full-blown Buffo, puffed by every quill. So every pen, every poem puffed him up, sort of blew him up through praise. Once again, this reference to the toad, fed with soft dedication all day long. So all poets who wanted his money would feed him with soft dedication all day long. Horace and he went hand in hand in song. His library were busts of poets dead, and a true Pindar stood without a head. So reference to his library where poets were mauled rather than, good poets were mauled rather than praised. Received of wits an undistinguished race, who first his judgment asked and then a place. So all the inferior poets would come to him to ask for a place. Much they extolled his pictures, much his seat, and flattered every day and some days eat. So once again, that reference to dinner, you will see these people came to party with Bob Doddington and enjoyed his sprawling dinners. Till grown more frugal in his riper days, so obviously his estate vanished, he paid some bards with port, wine, and some with praise. To some a dry rehearsal was assigned, and others, harder still, be paid in kind. So in his maturer days, he paid them cash. Dryden alone came not nigh, came not near. Dryden alone escaped this judging eye. So once again, Pope is comparing himself. The points of comparison, you see, are to Dryden, poet of eminence, Horace. So Pope is sort of putting himself in a kind of elite company. Like Dryden, he has evaded the attention of false patrons. But still the great have kindness in reserve. He helped to bury whom he helped to starve. So obviously he would bury these poor poets also who came to patronize, came for his patronage. May some choice patron bless every grey goose queer. May every Bavius is a poor poet, have his Buffo still. So when a statesman wants a day's defense, or envy holds a whole week's war with sense, or simple pride for flattery makes demands, may dunes by dunes be whistled off my hands. So he says, I do not want these patrons. So Pope's point here in criticizing Buffo is not merely to criticize the man, Bob Doddington. It's also creating the system of patronage and false patronage, whereby a wealthy man can sort of support false poets, inferior poets, only if they write dedications to him, right? So this unholy nexus between poet and the patron is coming under the satiric scanner of Pope. So as I point out, Pope is not only, criticizing the certain particular people in Arbuthnot, he's also criticizing the literary culture of the period and its lacuna, right? So, and those they left me, but they left me Gay. Now, Gay obviously is a person in your syllabus, John Gay, who was one of the preeminent dramatists of the period, but Gay died very poor, right? So, and Pope apparently sort of tended to Gay in his last years. So those they left me, for they left me Gay. Now Gay received no patronage, as it were, left me to see neglected genius bloom. So Pope is contrasting the false patronage of Buffo with the negligence to John Gay. Left me to see neglected genius bloom, neglected die, and tell it on his tomb. Of all thy blameless life, the soul return, my verse and Queensberry weeping over thy urn. So the Duke and the Duchess of Queensberry also tended to Gay in his final days. So Pope is referring to his words of praise and Queensberry, the noblemen of Queensberry, as mourning Gay. And nobody else mourned because he did not get a patron. Oh, let me live my own and die so too. To live and die is all I have to do. So he's saying, let me live independently. So he's claiming poetic independence rather than subscribe to any patron. Maintain a poet's dignity and ease, and see what friends and read what books I please. So Pope is also carving out this niche, as it were, for the man of letters who is independent of the political and patronage system of contemporary England. Now, this is approximately 1735. You will find that the system of patronage virtually sort of is challenged very significantly by Samuel Johnson's letter to Lord Chesterfield in 1755. So 30 years later, Samuel Johnson will be sort of making the same kind of claim for independence. And above a patron do I condescend, sometimes to call a minister my friend. I was not born for courts or great affairs. I pay my debts and believe and say my prayers. Can sleep without a poem in my head, nor know if Dennis be alive or dead. So Pope is carving for himself, as I say, a space of poetic independence where he's not influenced in his satires by any kind of patronage. Why am I asked? What next shall see the light? Heavens, was I born for nothing but to write? So once again, this kind of self-projection where Pope is saying that, he is the man of letters, the professional man of letters who is born to write. Has life no joys for me to be grave? Have I no friend to serve, no soul to save? I found him close with Swift. Indeed, no doubt, cries prating Balbus, something will come out. So people are now speculating about what Pope will write next. So Pope is creating a kind of air of mystic around him, a kind of a halo around him of the poet who is independent of a patron, who is, who is sought by almost every other poet, and whose entire, writings become the source of major social inquiry. It is all in vain, deny it as I will, no such a genius never can lie still. And then for mine obliging mistakes, the first lampoon Sir Will or Bubo makes, once again the reference to lampoons against his poetry. Poor guileless I, and can I choose by smile, when every coxcomb knows me by my style. Right. So once again, these references once again show how Pope seeks to project himself as the poet who is identifiable by his style. So, cursed be the verse, how well soever it flow, that tends to make one worthy man my foe. So he's saying that I have to write satire. It is my genius. and for this I will draw the enmity of many a people. Give virtue scandal, innocence a fear, or from the soft-eyed virgin steal a tear. But he who hurts a harmless neighbor's peace, insults fallen worth or beauty in distress, who loves a lie, lame slander helps about, who writes a libel, or who copies out. So he's criticizing false satire, which unnecessarily criticizes or insults. That fop whose pride affects a patron's name, yet absent wounds an author's honest fame. Who can your merit selfishly approve, and show the sense of it without the love? Who has the vanity to call you friend, yet wants the honor injured to defend, and tells you whatever you think, whatever you say, and if he lie not, must at least betray? Who to the dean and silver bell can swear, and see at cannons what never was there? Who reads but with a lust to misapply, makes satire a lampoon and fiction lie. So he's suggesting that, whoever is writing false poetry or writing lampoons, a lash like mine no honest man shall dread, but all such babbling blockheads in his stead. So Pope is claiming that he will never lie, he will never write a poem to hurt anybody who is faultless. But if there is a fault, if there is a kind of a departure from the norm, his satire will lash that person. So Pope is also now not only claiming to be the epicenter of poetry, is also, and taste, is also a man who is the moral guardian, as it were, of the period, whose satire will hurt only and only if social norms and decorum is violated. Now, therefore, what have we done today? We have fundamentally covered two segments of the poem. The first segment talks about his inclination to write, his compulsion to write, and his inspiration to print. It's also talking about two very important, in the next section, about two important social and literary ills of the period. One is the formation of coteries and the jealousy of poets who brook no rival near their throne. And therefore, that figure is Atticus, and through it he criticizes Addison. And the next figure is Doddington, whom he criticizes as Buffo, and who is the false patron, who patronizes only on the basis of the amount of praise that he gets. So one who lacks taste. And he's suggesting that, these are the literary ills for which a poet like, genuine poets like Gay have had no sustenance and have had to lie in poetry, had to die in poetry. And finally, he claims that not only did he never write lampoons or hurt anybody in distress or anybody unnecessarily, he has also been the moral guardian of the period who had lashed the world if there had been any departures from the social norm. Now, in the next segment, which we shall take up in our next discussion, this will be the final discussion on the text actually, we'll look at the two other portraits that Pope makes. One is Sporus, who will be Lord Harvey, and the other will be Sappho, who will be Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. And he will also talk about his parentage, and he will also talk about friendship, right? So these will be his last movements in the poem. But for now, I will stop sharing my screen, and I will stop the recording and allow you to put your questions. Just give me a moment.